Sure. Thank you, Megha, and thanks and welcome to all the participants who have made time in the middle of the day. If COVID was not enough, we have torrential rains here in Mumbai, which obviously does complicate even work from home situation for a lot of you. We appreciate the network, the internet, everything obviously takes a beating in this sort of weather. So we will sort of make sure that we sort of reinforce some of the thoughts you may already have about the stewardship code, or maybe bring to awareness some aspects which may have been missed out in the initial readings of it. So, as a matter of brief introduction, stewardship code, as is globally being envisaged, and India is no different, is to have a very well documented, reported engagement between institutional investors and the portfolio companies. Now, insofar as institutional investors are concerned, these are by and large pooling vehicles which are regulated by regulators. It could be in Indian context. Mutual funds or alternate investment funds, AIF, which are regulated by SEBI, insurers or pension funds, and so on and so forth. Uh, I think uh, I think as a matter of brief background, where did this all get started and what is it part of? Which will also help us understand where some of the intent is coming from. Is that in 2008, after the global financial crisis sort of came about, in an aftermath of analysis of what went wrong, why things were the way they were, regulators globally using the IOSCO platform arrived at consensus that there are some sort of weak links which need to be fixed. The first one was addressed from a structure perspective. We started seeing the promotion of segregated liabilities type structures, or protected cell companies, or variable capital companies in Singapore, and so on and so forth, which legally allow for ring fencing of liabilities. That was the first issue, that was taken up from a structure perspective, which is why globally you would see the regulators are slowly moving towards ring fence kind of structures, so that the liability of one particular pool is not sort of flowing over to other pooled sort of accounts. The second aspect that the regulators focused on was making the local domestic laws more robust. You would see a good part of it coming out in our Companies Act of 2013. The fact that we increased the public shareholding participation in portfolio companies, and a lot more focus on the directors' fiduciary responsibilities, stakeholder engagements, and so on and so forth. This, on the other hand, still was down to up looking, because it was focused more on the companies. Stewardship code, on the other hand, looks at the investors themselves. That are your participations meaningful enough? Are you sort of engaging with the portfolio companies and monitoring your companies on certain very critical parameters which are important from a governance perspective? Now these areas could range from performance, which could be financial, or performance from whatever was the expected benchmarks, so on and so forth. It could be how have the portfolio companies adhered to the strategy that they had originally outlined. The governance of the company itself, the board control, are the decision-making processes being properly followed? The environmental social governance, the ESG policies, again, that is slowly coming, seeping into the formal law. ESGs, I'm sure a lot of the audience would be aware, is something that institutional investors, DFIs, sovereign wealth funds had been asking from private equity funds. And it was obviously reported standards that managers had to sort of maintain. But now slowly ESG is also creeping into the formal legal expectations from some of the institutional investors. Last but not the least, the entire agenda is to have it documented and have a demonstrated connection between these institutional investors, so that their own beneficiaries, the unit holders, the pensioners whose money is being managed by the pension fund, they're aware of how responsibly their participating pooling vehicle has behaved. Uh, on top of it, I think the other piece was that how has the entire law been developed in India? I think unlike other countries like UK and some of the other jurisdictions, mature markets, where you had one formal law for all the institutional investors in the country, India has sort of digressed a bit. While Ministry of Finance had taken some responsibility through a committee where both IRDA, PFRDA for insurance and pension funds, and SEBI for mutual funds had sort of come together to formulate a stewardship code. But what had happened is eventually there was a fragmentation in that. SEBI has its own code, IRDA is a separate, and pension funds also separate. Perhaps some of the thinking could have been that these different institutional investors have a very different expectation from investor-based perspective. Mutual funds obviously are reporting their NAVs perhaps on a daily basis and so on and so forth. So the focus and the engagement could be on a different tranche as compared to insurers whose primary objective may be slightly different than managing and reporting investments. So with that, I think SEBI did launch towards the end of last year, early this year, a stewardship code, which has now come into effect even for alternative investment funds beginning July 1, 2020. Obviously, there was a shift because of the COVID related aspects. With that, given our firm's preeminence in fund formation space, we thought it would be relevant for a lot of the the participants on the call that how we see this entire stewardship code being being made applicable to alternative investment funds. What are the expectations? What are and what are the issues that AIFs may face as they go on this path for complying with the stewardship code? With that, I think I would now welcome to the discussion Madhu. Like Megha introduced, Madhu heads the legal and compliance at ICICI Ventures, again, one of the most pioneering fund management houses in India. So Madhu, with your experience, we couldn't have thought of any more apt to speak on this topic. So Madhu, the first question to you, what are the issues and what are the aspects you feel are being focused on or being targeted by the stewardship code? Or what do you think could have been the agenda that SEBI is trying to drive through?
Good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for inviting me to the panel. Something which I will first sort of would like to say is how the stewardship code actually originated globally. You rightly mentioned about the financial crisis was the reason why the stewardship code was contemplated. When the financial crisis happened, there was a lot of debate as to what was the causes for the financial crisis. Uh, in UK particularly, for example, shareholders were being blamed for putting too much of expectations on the board for higher returns, and also not having proper control over the board, and which led to probably certain egregious behavior by certain companies. That's how the UK regulators uh, start the code. Uh, they felt that an inappropriate behavior could be sort of prevented by institutional investors if there is a closer engagement by the institutional investors with the boards of the companies. That's how the UK came out with the stewardship code. But the thing with the implementation of the stewardship code across the various jurisdictions and in India, one difference is that India is an outlier in the sense that India is been made mandatory. But if you go to many other jurisdictions, particularly for UK, for example, it's not mandatory. It's not mandatory that the investment manager adopt the code. If they are not adopting the code, probably inform the investors as to how they are managing they are monitoring the district investments. In US, for example, it's not mandatory. But in US, if you're a member of the investors stewardship group, to which I believe most of the investors are members, so it is a voluntary membership. As a result of which, the investment managers actually implement the code. In Australia, for example, it is not mandatory. Singapore, it is not mandatory. So that's the way it is. But India, it has been made mandatory because this code has been imposed under the SEBI Act. Having said that, is actually the code is made on the basis of six pillars, six codes. One is the requirement that you should have a stewardship policy formulation, and then the second code is that you should have a proper conflict of interest policy. There should be a manner in which you are monitoring the investing companies, and in case there is any you feel there is some intervention required in any company in which probably you feel there could be issues, to ensure that the issues doesn't probably escalate, or so you could have a procedure in terms of how we should engage with the company. You could probably collaborate with other investors and ensure that this issue, if there is any, is sort of managed. Then you should have a voting policy, and the voting policy should be disclosed on your website. Not necessary, I believe it's not necessary that how you vote on a certain matter needs to be disclosed, but you may be able to probably disclose the manner in which you voted to your investors and not maybe publicly disclosed. And then the institutional investor should periodically report their stewardship activities to the investor. That's the 6 pillars on which it is being formulated. Having said that, we are a Cat 2 investment manager, and we mainly invest in unlisted entities. In a way, we are actually following whatever the code is prescribed in relation to our unlisted entities, because that's where we are actually probably in a position where we got requirement under the code that you should engage with the industry companies, which we are in a way we are probably able to do it much better with respect to a unlisted company. And in most of our unlisted companies, we have our nominee directors too, and probably in an unlisted company, whatever is the requirement under the code in terms of having a proper governance standards, ensuring that there is a financial discipline by the companies, there's a professional management of the industry companies to ensure that ultimately this company is in a position to go for an IPO, get listed, and that's when probably the code will apply. If your limits, if you set a limit in terms of which, like in case of ICICI Venture, we have set a limit that if you don't, our investment is not in excess of a certain limit, we will not apply the code to that company. The reason being that we don't want the investment team to spend too much of time in on an investment, which from a fund perspective may not be very significant. They should probably better spend time on other investments which may require probably better attention.
Thanks, Madhu. I think that was a very fair summary of what we've also sort of seen in our engagement with other fund sponsors, that a lot of what should be the way to operate the governance framework is something that comes from their investors itself. I think India has obviously come a long, long way from when we had the earlier venture capital fund regulations with a 5 lakh rupee ticket size to
That's
something
right.
like the alternate investment funds where you have a 1 crore ticket size as a minimum base, right? And then again, India has not been looking at investors in isolation. A lot of global allocators of capital, whether it is sovereign wealth funds, whether it is developmental financial institutions like the IFCs, CDCs of the world, they have been allocating to AIFs. And we're not just talking about the tier 1 handful AIFs, but a lot of tier 2, tier 3 sort of spaces of fund managers have also started accessing institutional capital, where obviously it is the first rule of the game that you will have to sort of inherit the entire governance framework, the ESG expectation of the investor, and meet it, which obviously does raise the cost of operations, but at the same time brings a lot of the AIFs operating in India at par and frankly beating global standards, because there's so much more on impact that happens in India compared to some of the other markets. I think with that, I'll come to Simone. Simon, so Madhu summarized how SEBI may have looked at how different geographies have sort of progressed over the years. Now, the question to you is that we have seen institutional investors operate in a very ESG-driven environment today. There's a lot of focus on governance in the agenda. And yes, as one of your recent papers say, governance matters. So what is your brief high-level take on where we are today in this entire governance framework, the path forward, and do you frankly feel that there was a need to codify the stewardship policies as the way SEBI has gone about it, especially in the AIF context?
So I think if you look at you covered a lot of points, including ESG investing. Let's maybe get that out of the way. ESG investing really is, I think, is divided into two, right? Vis-a-vis the beneficiaries of a fund and vis-a-vis the portfolio company itself. Now, let's not sort of repeat what you've already discussed as to why ESG matters. The simple truth is that these are parameters that are expected to give a superior financial result and nothing else. It's not a negative list. It is a positive list and a positive sort of agenda for companies to follow. And out of the three sort of letters there, governance is given the most importance. Similarly, not just ESG parameters are not just important for a portfolio company, but are equally important for a fund that actually collects retail or institutional monies to invest in portfolio companies. Now, ESG vis-a-vis the fund, I think, is a matter that, honestly, if you look at AIF regulations, already many criteria, whether it's the conflicts policy, whether it's voting requirements for mutual funds, have already been populated in various SEBI regulations. This is not something that is really new to the PE industry as a whole. But having said that, it is good to have these things out in the open, disclosed, and also important for SEBI to drive home the point that that it is in the hands of investors to ensure that there is proper checks and balances vis-a-vis a company. And so far we've seen minority shareholders always being a protected class. I think with this stewardship code, you've seen now an active role being actually given to minority shareholders or public shareholders, and then not just sort of acting as a protected class. So there is a active role given to these shareholders, whether it's to disclose voting, the manner in which they want to vote, or their voting policies really, whether it is to intervene with respect to when they see a problem, whether it is to monitor the investee company, all of this, of course, in the listed context. But there is an active role that has been cast on shareholders. So I think it is really an interesting sort of counterbalance. Previously, you had promoters always cast with obligations and looked at as the controlling shareholder, perhaps with not necessarily the brightest of all lights. And you saw minority shareholders being a protected class. I think given how retail participation and Indian participation has really increased in terms of in the markets, this is a good segue to make into what to ensure also that our markets become more diversified, more responsible, and beneficiaries of these funds have some visibility in terms of what's really happening vis-a-vis a company.
Sure, sure. So thanks, Simone, for that. I think now let's go straight to the principles themselves. The Stewardship Code, to briefly summarize, is a set of 6 principles that have been sort of enshrined now. The first one, I think, going straight to that one, the first one concerns institutional investors now requiring to have formulated a comprehensive policy on discharge of their stewardship expectations. Now, Madhu, coming to you, I think you did indicate that there are certain thresholds you would look at. When you sort of look at which companies are you going to sort of focus on. It could be by way of a percentage of how much of the corpus was allocated to a deal, or what is the chunk of that company that you're holding, or perhaps do you have the ability to move the needle because you have a nominee director on the board or not. Having said that, assuming that you have some thresholds met, and accordingly you want to focus on the stewardship principles, even from voting and other expectations perspective, how would you distribute the responsibilities between the compliance team and the investment team, given that the active engagement from the fund's perspective with the portfolio companies led by the investment team, who identify the deal, who sort of monitor the value add to the portfolio company and the exit opportunities and so on and so forth. So how do you see the balance and from practical perspective between the different teams to meet the obligations under the stewardship code?
Thanks, Richie. So as I said earlier, the issue which we actually wanted to discuss was in terms of how much should we be engaging in any of the listed entities, and how many listed investments we will have in any particular fund. And we mostly invest into unlisted entities, or bulk of our investments will be into unlisted entities, and that's where we actually spend most of our time in terms of growing the company to ensure that ultimately the company is in a position to probably go for an IPO in 2 years, in 2-3 years time horizon. Having said that, if it's a listed company, the investment is too low, whether that issue which we actually wanted to, we decided to pondered over, or as to whether it will be fair for our investment team to spend too much of time on an investment on which the in terms of the total corpus of the fund, the investment may not be very significant. So, and the code does give you some sort of a flexibility. The SEBI's code does give you some sort of a flexibility in terms of if it is too small an investment, probably you need not apply the code. So for us, the way we determined the criteria was that if our investments was not in excess of 5% of the corpus of the fund, we will not apply the code to that investment. Or the total investment size is not in excess of 10% of the total fund size. Sorry, the first one is 5% of the equity capital of the company. Or if you have a nominee director on the board of the company. That's the way we actually formulated the policy. Having formulated the policy, then the issue was in terms of how do we manage this, manage the engagement with the industry company, the listed company in which the code, in respect of this, the code will apply. So the primarily the responsibility of engaging with the industry companies of the investment team. So they are the people who monitor the investments, who are the people who are involved when the investments are made, when monitoring the investments, and then see how the investments over the course of over the period of the investment term, how it progresses. So the responsibility is purely on the investment team. The compliance role is basically in terms of ensuring that the requirements of the code are met. The reportings are made as and when required to the investors, and also whenever it is required to be publicly disclosed on the website. And then the third responsibility of the secretarial team is to ensure that the voting records, the voting decisions, everything are properly maintained. That's how the responsibilities are distributed among the investment team, secretarial team, and the compliance team.
Right. Thank you, Madhu. I think moving on to the second principle, which concerns conflict of interest and the fact that the AIFs are now expected to have a clear policy on how they manage conflicts. I think, like Simone indicated, the AIF regulations already had a very clearly laid out expectation that the private placement memorandum of the fund should have adequate disclosure on conflict of interest. A, how will they be recognized? B, what are the areas which could be perceived as conflicts? And the third was, how would the conflicts be resolved? Conflicts cannot always be avoided, but they can definitely be managed. So as long as the process of management has been laid out, the AIF regulations per se would have been addressed. Now to that extent, Madhu, the question to you, and then I'll come to you, Simone. Madhu, as a fund manager, what are the typical areas of conflicts that you feel can come up in the life cycle of the fund, and some broad principles that you follow to that extent?
So if you, as you know, most of the PPM actually addresses the various manner in which the conflict, if at all, if it arises, is actually addressed. And in the way we operate is, in case the PPM there's a particular conflict which is not addressed, the way to resolve is not particularly addressed in the PPM, then we have a conflict, a group-wise conflict of interest policy. When we apply the principles of the internal conflict resolution policy, if that also doesn't give us a guideline in terms of addressing a particular conflict, then we have a conflict resolution committee. So there are three layers under which we actually operate a conflict resolution policy. One is under the PPM. If the PPM doesn't address, then we have an internal code for addressing a conflict. And third, if the second one doesn't address, then we have a conflict resolution committee which comprises of senior officials of the investment manager. And any decision taken is put before the supervisory board of the fund, and finally the decision is taken as to how to deal with the conflict. Coming to the question in terms of what are the typical conflict situation which may arise, so some of them are like, say, one particular fund managed by say ICC Venture as an investment in a particular company, and another fund also wants to make an investment into the same company. Then there's a question of conflict between the two funds. How do we resolve that? One way to deal with that will be probably the fund document itself may be provided that you could, in such situation, probably you go to the supervisory board of the respective fund and take that consent before you make an investment into a company in which an earlier fund has already made an investment. That's one of the examples. There could be instances where probably an employee or a relative or an immediate relative of an employee may have some connection with the company in which you are proposing to make an investment.
Right. Well, thank you. To you, Simone, have you seen any issues coming out of conflicted situations? Have you seen issues where the investor decided to abstain from voting as opposed to not to, saying no to the motion, or what are the issues that you have seen from a conflict perspective?
No, fair enough. I think, so Richie, there are two aspects here to be considered, right? Conflicts at the time of making an investment and conflicts during the in the duration of the investment made in the portfolio company. And
Right.
I don't think the stewardship code is looking to overhaul what SEBI has already included within the AIF regulations, which apply anyway for listed plus unlisted in any sort of investment. And this applies only for listed. But and this code might have been a little bit, might have had a gap if they didn't contemplate conflicts as well as one of these stewardship policy requirements. Now, have we now, and as Madhu rightly said, there are various instances where conflicts could arise, and and that's a day and day situation, especially where and the more investors look at funds that have expertise and have strong credentials. The minute you have strong credentials, it means that you've obviously done this business for a while, which means that conflicts with respect to whether it's your affiliates, whether it's other portfolio companies that you've invested in, will obviously arise. So it's important to obviously have a documented process, and that documented process is followed. We have seen situations where conflicts have arisen, where an investor wanted to sort of invest into an Indian company, and because of the way the PPM was really worded, they require an LPAC approval really. It's and just because of the way the definition of a portfolio company affiliate, or especially where one fund is buying from another fund. It could be perceived as maybe rotating capital, but really, if it's an arm's length basis, there should be no problem. But more interesting me is that conflicts during the duration of the investment, especially whether to abstain from voting, whether not to vote, again has another dilemma, because the third principle I'm sure we'll discuss again later is how do you man and third, fourth, fifth principles talk about voting policies, talk about really intervention, talk about monitoring investing companies. Now, there could be a situation where there's a conflict between the conflict policy itself and your obligation to actually monitor investment. So it'll be interesting to see how that really needs to be played out, and maybe exceptions to the exception should also may have to be sort of looked into.
Right. No, thank you. I think a point I would like to make, because the session is geared more towards alternate investment funds, is the dependence of the fund manager on the investor's LPAC, LP advisory committee or advisory board or investor advisory board, to resolve some of the conflicts that may arise. I think as a matter of thumb rule, if we could put the conflicts in different buckets, those which can be resolved by the board of directors of the investment manager, those which may be escalated to the advisory board or the investors, sort of the largest coming together by way of the advisory board and giving some guidance to the manager. The third could be to go to the investors as a block and take some consent out, maybe majority, super majority, depending on what the issue is. Or the fourth could literally be to abstain from that situation altogether. Now, because of the immediate level of escalation, I hope the audio is clear.
Yeah, now it is.
Okay.
You talk a little
So,
bit for half a minute.
okay. Right. See, I think to quickly repeat, the point was that there is a lot of focus on investors advisory board in helping the manager resolve the conflict, because it is obviously a smaller gathering than the entire investor base, and the managers have a lot of confidence on the larger investors because they have hopefully seen these situations in the past. But what we have seen recently come up as issues are that sometimes members of the advisory board are not comfortable that by giving guidance or a clear guidance to the manager, are they going to sort of breach the no liability on account of fiduciary or no fiduciary on the part of the advisory board members? That is an issue that comes up. The second aspect is sometimes members on the advisory board believe that other members are not in a similar situation as them. Some may have a DFI, expectations. Some may be sovereign wealth funds with a different agenda, and so on and so forth. So there is a high likelihood that some of the advisory board members may abstain from voting. In those cases, a tricky issue can come up that how does the manager then go about resolving this, which is where we have seen more uniquely fund managers agreeing that in case there is a high likelihood of some situation arising, can we sort of not take it to the advisory board and literally take it straight to the investor as a group, which is a deviation from how we have seen advisory boards being the primary body to resolve conflicts. I think with that, let's come to the third principle set out in the Stewardship Code concerning monitoring the business of the investee companies. And here, I think, Simone, I'll come straight to you on how you have seen this entire monitoring process being conducted by some of the global allocators. Have you seen some best practices being followed? You advise some of the largest names on a global basis who allocate to public equities. So have you, in your experience, seen some of the best practices which you feel could be relevant for the Indian audiences who perhaps may be looking at it for the first time because now it has been applied to AIFs?
So Richie, I think it's important to sort of first look at the rules of the game. One is an obligation vis-a-vis your investors to monitor the investment, but you are also operating in a listed company in the context of the LODR, listing and disclosure requirements, which contemplate all shareholders being given access to similar or same information. That's one. That's one restriction that you need to look at. Second is vis-a-vis insider trading. No one shareholder is allowed to get insider information unless it is for certain legitimate purposes, and just monitoring investments may not necessarily qualify as legitimate purpose. So, with these two restrictions, I think how you monitor investments really becomes important. And I think it's important to sort of to clearly demonstrate that what you're doing is monitoring investments for the purposes of really your beneficiaries and not for the purposes of the investee company, because some may sort of assume that in these certain circumstances you are exercising control. That is not the case. The intent really is to monitor whether it's financial parameters, whether it is regulatory parameters, just seeing from practice what's really happening in the market and countervening and counter sort of balancing what's really happening on your portfolio company. So I think those are important criteria. Now, let me give you an example of how monitoring investments really made, and we advised on one of those large deals where from a Fortis perspective, because of the the important monitoring of investments, minority shareholders were allowed or came together to actually remove executive directors of the board and reinstate directors that they thought were more beneficial for the company. Now, this doesn't arise as a result of really control over the company. This is really shareholder rights that you have under applicable law itself used in a productive manner, and monitoring that happened because of public information that was around. So if you see codes that have been put up, whether it's HDFC, SBI, all of them sort of do contemplate and stress on the fact that we will endeavor to have meetings with the company, but we cannot promise that because the company in its right mind is able to, may have the ability to refuse, especially at a time where there is price sensitive information or there's something that is crucial to the company. They also do mention that certain parameters would be looked at with respect to the industry company, and it's not to be assumed that they're taking onus over the business of the company. With respect to, I think, listed companies, since this is mandated for AIFs and mutual funds and sort of other institutional investors, hopefully level playing field will be given to other shareholders as well. And the flow of information when asked, even if one shareholder gets it, the intent is not for it to be to the detriment of other shareholders. So perhaps the corollary of this is to ensure broader disclosures, better disclosures by listed companies, so that this can actually be achieved. And at the end, and we will come to the next principle, because this ties into the next principle of intervention. When you when you monitor constantly, basis what's happening in the public realm, and basis the information that the company can give you on a subject to its obligations under law, can you really achieve the next principle intervention at a rightly time. So all in all, I think an important aspect, but it should be made clear also to your investors when drafting the stewardship code that the intent is really to monitor basis certain parameters, not promising control over the investee company.
Right, right. See, I think a point to sort of for the broader participants to understand is that the stewardship code are a set of principles that are expected from institutional investors, and so that there's a more reported engagement with their own investor base. It does not sort of provide any power or rights or extra, sort of visibility to the institutional investor. It's not a position of law, or that anyone who's accessing capital from AIFs is now put to notice that, look here, this investor comes with an extra set of rights or powers and so on and so forth. This is simply a mechanism to deliver more information to the investors of the AIF itself, and accordingly put the fund manager on the hook that how active they have been, and or have they been passive where they ought to have been active, which frankly also brings into highlight the fourth principle, which Simone sort of focused on the policy of intervention. I think what is absolutely very critical here is to begin with, is intervention required to have identified situations when an intervention sort of comes into play, whether it is worth the management's time and attention to create the intervention. Like Madhu indicated, there are so many thresholds one can think of, like what part of the corpus is allocated to the portfolio, and how big is it from the fund's perspective. I think that could merit how the level of intervention also. Obviously, if one is only focused on from a voting perspective, one can always combine with other investors, vote in a particular manner so that you achieve the required intervention. But the depth in which of AIF could be expected to intervene is obviously directly proportionate to the amount of holding that the AIF has in the portfolio company, and frankly, what part of the corpus does that investment actually do. With that, I think I'll come to the fifth principle, Simone, which is all about the voting rights and disclosures for the same. We saw how mutual funds had been mandated in 2010 and later on in 2014 to not just have a very clear-cut voting policy on how they would vote on different situations, but also disclose on an annual basis how have they actually voted on each of the different resolutions that came up their way. So what do you think are some of the learnings, and how do you think the voting aspects can be handled by AIFs?
I think the one good thing about this is that you don't have to disclose right away or prior, right? It is an annual statement that perhaps will have to be made at on a yearly basis. Now, there's a dichotomy here really in whether or not the actual voting results should be made publicly available. It should be made available only to your investors, because they can be, uh, whether or not, other than by poll, technically speaking, it's really a secret, quote unquote, ballot. Although the company does have a fair understanding basis the information that you have, other shareholders are not privy to that. And therefore, I think that privacy of the investor may be compromised if voting results need to be publicly disclosed. The language is a little broad, which may result in a dichotomy as to whether just the voting policy needs to be disclosed really, or also the voting result. Now, the intent could be, look, at the end of the day, people need to be responsible in terms of how they voted for a situation, and to cast an onus on the investor. That being said, I think the privacy of the investor should also needs to be kept in mind, and there has to be a sort of a counterbalance. You are accountable really only to your beneficiaries. You are not necessarily accountable to the other shareholders of the company. You have the ability to reach out to other shareholders of the company should an intervention be required, but you are not necessarily responsible, or you are not accountable to other investors in the company. And therefore, in my mind, this could be a little bit of a dichotomy in terms of disclosing publicly versus disclosing only to your beneficiaries. So time will tell how that will really evolve.
Right, right. I think here what is interesting to note is, and I'm literally quoting from the actual text of the stewardship code, The principle 5 says that institutional investors should have a clear policy on voting and disclosure of voting activity. Now, this disclosure of voting activity the guidance has been given by SEBI in this regard. And the guidance 3 actually says, and I'm reading from the text of the code, the periodicity of disclosure. So it could be an annual disclosure of what happened in the past year. Details of actual voting for every proposed resolution in investing companies, that is for, against, or abstain. Rationale for such voting, and fourth, the manner of disclosure, whether in annual report to investors, quarterly basis on website, etc. So I think it seems that the guidance from SEBI for even AIFs in listed companies seems quite clear. There has to be a disclosure of how you voted in each of the resolution items in the investee companies. Here, it may be difficult to justify that the ticket size or my participation in the portfolio company was below a de minimis and so on and so forth, because everything would have come up for the investor voting. I think where there is some leeway is the manner of disclosure, where the guidance is example in annual reports to investors or quarterly basis on website. So obviously, if one chooses to go for the annual report to investors, then to that extent, the AI would have confined the universe of investors who are aware of how they voted, which could be literally their own investor base or LP base. So I think that frankly is a clear guidance given from SEBI. So I think it'll be interesting how AIFs that do participate, how they go about it. But I would assume that especially for funds that invest in listed companies, it is part of any institutional investor's expectation that how you vote will have to be shared at the end of the year basis. So for AIFs, I don't see this to be a major issue, because it was perhaps anyways part of the MIS being shared with the investors anyways. But I think SEBI at this point in time has not, at least it's not clear on the guidance whether this also needs to be put on the website, because that's just an option out there. I think with that, I will move on to the last principle which SEBI has mandated, which is on the periodicity of the reporting, that how it should be reported, which is where I touched about that, everything needs to be reported. The stakeholder who has to receive the report is by and large the investors whom we are focused on, unless obviously it is in context of mutual funds, where outside of the stewardship code, there are other circulars in 2010 and 14 which did require AMCs to disclose in their annual reports how they have voted, which obviously can be accessed by anyone on visiting their website. So I think with that, perhaps maybe first I'll ask Madhu, you that what is your sense on this entire code and the reporting obligation? Uh, do you see that this is an engagement more relevant for mutual funds, as opposed to AIs, where the investors anyways download on you the entire governance code and how everything should be reported? Do you feel that AIs may see value in this extra ushering of reporting from the regulator, or you think you were in a good zone already?
I guess we were already on a good zone, in the sense, unlike mutual funds, our investment into listed entities are not far less. And wherever there is an investment in an listed company, in terms of whatever the requirement, in terms of whatever obligations we assume with certain investors or under the PPM, we are anyway obliged to report those to the investors. So we are under a contractual obligation with most of the institutional investors in terms of what the reporting requirements are. And in case of some of the investors, they may require us to even report to them the way we have voted, what the policy of voting, etc. maybe. So I think it doesn't add too much of complexity in terms of in addition to what we are already doing.
Right. Sure. I think Simone, do you want to add anything to this, or should we go straight to some of the questions that have been queued up already?
I think let's go straight to the questions, Richie.
Sure. So I think the first couple of questions from Samir Kapadia. Samir's question was that stewardship responsibilities be outsourced. If yes, what all aspects can be outsourced and what aspects cannot be outsourced? So obviously, while and I'll take the first attempt, and then maybe I'll request Madhu, you, Simone, to also add to it. Speaking from an AI's perspective, what can be outsourced are more administrative aspects there's always a reliance on proxy advisory firms and so on and so forth. What cannot be outsourced are the more fundamental duties of a fund manager, which are to manage the portfolio investment itself. That I'm sure you're aware of a 2011 circular that SEBI had earlier issued, that some of the fundamental duties of a particular intermediary cannot be outsourced. Now, a lot of stewardship code also applies on monitoring the company, taking voting related decisions, resolving conflicts, and so on and so forth. So resolving conflicts or monitoring the portfolio company cannot pretty much be outsourced, because as a fund manager your duties are not just to invest or exit, but even add value and monitor the investment. So I think apart from relying on proxy advisory firms, it may be we'll have to literally look at item by item what all you want to outsource. Otherwise it can be a little difficult. uh, Madhu, Simone, you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's only the vote in relation to voting topic can take the advice of proxy advisory firm or institutional shareholder services. Other than that, I don't think there is anything which any of those principles could be outsourced, because the compliance is basically the responsibility of the investment manager themselves. That's not something which can outsource.
Right, right. Simone, anything further to add there?
Let's move on, Richie. I agree.
Okay, okay. The next batch of questions from Samir and Jatin Chunani were around this entire conflict of interest committee and formalizing a conflict of interest policy and so on and so forth. So I think to begin with, yes, it is mandatory to formulate the conflict of interest policy to begin with, because the AF regulations pretty much expect under regulations 11 concerning PPMs and regulation 21, where all AIFs are required to devise a conflict of interest policy. They need to sort of identify what are the areas of conflict, how they will be recognized, how they will be resolved, and what are the different buckets of resolution. So this was anyways required under the AF regulations. Uh, Pretty much it can be perceived that they cover what the expectation under the stewardship code also is. I think what stewardship code does is that if in case there was any gap in how you have designed the policy and what SEBI now requires, I think that gap needs to be filled up. And obviously it becomes a lot more shared information with your investors. In a other scenario, you could have disclosed the conflict only to, let's say, the advisory board, the LPAC, and so on and so forth. But now if it's part of the stewardship code, then it may need to be shared with your entire investor base and not just your large ticket investors. uh, I think moving to the next question again from Jatin. Monitoring of listed investee companies is difficult in this COVID era. What fund manager should do? Outline the same in stewardship code. So maybe I think I'll start with you, Simon. So what practices have you seen in monitoring of listed investee companies, and any nuance because of COVID? Anything different you've seen?
No, I think the same principles apply. Some fund managers do have meetings with companies to discuss matters that are not really price sensitive. That's one. Second is maybe do a compare and contrast to what other companies of like nature are doing, and compare with what the company is doing. And three really is basically information that is available that the company discloses, and investor presentations that the company makes, be an active participant in those as well, and maybe ask questions at the relevant time. These are really the three principles that we've seen people doing on a consistent basis.
Sure, sure. So, any parting thoughts, Simon, Madhu, you want to add to the discussion?
I think, look, corporate governance is really a matter that SEBI is very keenly pursuing for the right reasons. We need to ensure that our companies are clean, our companies are geared towards best practices, because we're also inviting a lot of retail investors to invest into this entity, into this asset class. So, given that, given the current times, given the fact that more responsibility is really thrust upon on the regulator, and just given what's really happening on the economy today, at the very least, corporate governance is something that is expected not only from an Indian company but also of funds that actually take retail money to invest in it. We expect more and more perhaps um, the role of SEBI to get more and more enhanced in this regard, and rightfully so, in terms and boards to also comply with these obligations and take them seriously, because the consequence of not doing this is quite dire.
Right. Thanks, Simone. Madhu, anything further to add from your perspective?
Yeah, I guess the intention of the regulator is sort of to create an ecosystem where the universe of investors, whether it is mutual funds, or AIFs, or pension funds, who invest into listed companies, they create the environment on a long-term basis, which sort of results into an improved corporate governance, ESG, compliance with ESG responsibilities, which overall results in an improvement in the financial system.
Got it. Thank you. So I think to conclude, I would, and again, because the focus was on stewardship code, but with an intent to focus on the AIFs that participate, I think I would like to conclude by saying that how the regulations are now evolving around the AIF domain. I think it's very interesting to see that to begin with, SEBI had prescribed to begin with what all should a PPM contain. This was part of the regulatory framework for AIFs to begin with. There were guidances given. Then we saw SEBI come out with standardized PPM format on what all should be disclosed. In fact, identify nil as a response if that particular commercial does not apply. So SEBI had already started intervening in what would have been traditionally an LP-GP investor fund manager interaction already out there, and started guiding that with the standardization of the PPM. Later on, we saw the expectation to get audit also conducted on an annual basis, whether the fund manager adhered strictly to what was committed in the PPM in actual practical aspects under the fund documents. We have also now seen performance benchmarking now kicking in. We see that agencies are still being identified, but soon we expect and anticipate that performance benchmarking will also become the norm of the day. And now you today see here the stewardship code, which obviously look at mutual funds and AIF with the same yardstick. So I think it's also comment on how the AIF industry is now shaping up. Obviously, we saw AIFs operate in a far more free environment close to a decade now. 2012, the regulation got introduced. We are in 2020 already. So over 8 to 10 years, you saw AIFs proliferate, a lot of free domain, free environment for fund managers to operate. And now SEBI is intervening, hopefully to enhance the quality of the product that is being offered and how they are regulated and monitored. So obviously a word of caution. It is very easy to look at AIFs and mutual funds both as pooling vehicles, but obviously the objectives were frankly diametrically opposite. Mutual funds were meant to be more retail products, whereas AIFs with the 1 crore ticket size is meant for sophisticated institutional participation. So accordingly, whenever any laws are introduced, I think that level of effort to just make sure that is the new expectation from the regulator in sync with what the regime stands for and what the regime promises to do. I think with that, I will, I thank all the, the participants and obviously my fellow panelists for making time for this session. And I hope everyone has now sort of understood more about stewardship code than they previously did before the session started. With that, I hand over control back to you, Megha. Maybe if you can sort of wind the session.